Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
We are jumping straight into a situation that has, well, pretty much captured global attention. We're taking a deep dive into these really critical recent events concerning Israel and Iran.
Yeah, and we're basing this entirely on the stack of source material you've shared with us. News reports, articles, transcripts,
A whole lot of information.
a significant amount, yeah, covering a major military action that unfolded just recently, early hours of Friday morning, June 13th, 2025, local time over there.
Exactly. So think of this as, your way to get quickly up to speed on what's frankly a rapidly developing and incredibly high-stakes situation.
Hmm.
Our mission here is to really unpack all these sources, pull out the key insights, the important nuggets, and help you understand what happened, why it matters, and crucially, what the immediate implications look like.
Right, we're trying to filter through the noise, give you the clearest picture possible based on what's being reported.
Because we're talking about some serious stuff here. Nuclear programs, these really deep-seated regional tensions that have been simmering for decades.
Absolutely. And potential impacts that just ripple outwards, right,
Mhm.
to global markets, high-level diplomacy. It's all kind of hanging in the balance.
It's a lot to navigate.
It is. But that's what we're here for. So let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack this. The absolute core event, the thing that dominated headlines early Friday, was this series of airstrikes launched by Israel into Iran.
Right.
And based on the accounts in these sources, this wasn't some small, limited action. It was presented as a significant military operation.
No, not small at all. The timing seems quite precise, too. It occurred early Friday morning, June 13th, around 3 a.m. Tehran time.
Which, for us here in the U.S., that was Thursday evening.
Yeah, roughly 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And Israel, we quickly gave this operation a name. They dubbed it Operation Rising Lion.
Operation Rising Lion. Okay? And the sources we have, they describe the scale, the nature of these initial strikes pretty clearly, pointing to a really substantial military effort.
Yeah, reports talk about dozens of individual airstrikes hitting various locations.
Dozens.
And they also specify dozens of Israeli aircraft took part in what was termed an initial wave of strikes.
An initial wave suggesting maybe more to come.
Potentially. And Israel itself characterized these actions using some pretty strong language. They called them preemptive strikes.
Preemptive.
And also, importantly, a preemptive, precise, combined offensive. That phrase, combined offensive, suggests coordination, different elements working together.
Okay. What about the immediate physical effects? What were people seeing and hearing on the ground, according to state media and news outlets?
Well, we saw reports almost immediately of multiple blasts being heard in and around Tehran, the capital.
Right.
And also, critically, near Natanz,
Mhm.
which, is a key Iranian nuclear
A
facility.
very well-known one.
Exactly. Then photos and videos started circulating,
Yeah.
reportedly showing actual damage. And not just, to suspected military sites, but apparently damage to civilian buildings in Tehran, too. Things like apartments, shattered skyscraper windows.
Mhm.
And smoke was also reported and visibly rising from the Natanz facility itself.
Okay, so even if the stated targets were military and nuclear, the effects, based on these initial reports, weren't strictly confined to those areas.
It seems not, based on those early visuals and accounts.
So what was Iran's immediate reaction? How did they respond as documented in these sources?
Well, Iranian state media did confirm that, yes, events were happening. They acknowledged the strikes, though maybe without giving extensive detail right at the beginning.
Okay.
Operationally, their immediate response was swift. Iran's air defense system was put on full alert, apparently across the whole country.
Full alert.
And the airspace over Tehran was temporarily closed to all air traffic, which indicates, a pretty fast, high-level defensive posture, preparing for maybe more strikes or a wider fight.
And Israel, on the other side, was clearly bracing for impact, right? Expecting immediate retaliation from Iran.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention sirens going off across Israel. Officials there describe them as preemptive warnings.
Preemptive warnings.
Yeah. And a special state of emergency, basically. A national emergency was declared nationwide very quickly.
Wow.
And that came with immediate, widespread restrictions. Things like banning large gatherings, closing schools, advising against non-essential work.
So affecting daily life immediately.
Big time. The health ministry even put out specific guidance telling hospitals to move critical functions, patients, into protected areas, and also to discharge non-urgent patients to free up beds and capacity.
That really paints a picture, doesn't it? That underscores the level of alert and the expectation on the Israeli side that Iran's response could be significant.
Yeah, potentially targeting civilian areas, critical infrastructure. They were moving the entire country into a defensive posture, not just, military bases.
Okay, let's pivot now. Let's talk about the why. Why does Israel say it took this, frankly, drastic action? The sources seem to draw heavily from statements by Prime Minister Netanyahu, other officials. What was their core stated reason for launching Operation Rising Lion?
The absolute core reason, the one articulated again and again by Israel Netanyahu, the IDF, is preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Right.
They frame this not just as like a regular security threat. They explicitly call it an existential threat to the state of Israel and to the wider world. For them, it's a matter of national survival.
An existential threat. And how close do these Israeli sources, the ones in our material, claim Iran actually is to crossing that nuclear threshold? What's their assessment?
Their assessment, as it's reported in these sources, is pretty alarming. Israeli sources suggest Iran is gearing up, not just with the nuclear material itself, but also to produce the ballistic missiles you'd need to deliver a weapon.
The delivery systems.
Exactly. One source quotes an Israeli official saying Iran might be only a few months away from being able to actually make a nuclear weapon.
Make one, not just have the material.
Right, implying the capability to assemble a device. And then there's this other really striking claim, cited often, from an Israeli military official. He stated that Iran has enough material to make 15 nuclear bombs within days.
15 bombs within days?
Within days. Now, they also explicitly accuse Iran of maintaining a secret program to build a nuclear weapon. So you see these different timelines mentioned, months away from making a weapon, days away from having material for 15 bombs.
Right. It highlights different aspects of how they see the threat.
Exactly. It's about the immediacy of the material versus the timeline for weaponization. But both are presented as urgent.
Those are incredibly specific, incredibly high-stakes claims about Iran's proximity to nuclear capability. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's quoted directly on the objective of the specific operation, right?
Yes, he described it very clearly as a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. The wording there, targeted, rollback, emphasizes specific objectives, not just, a broad attack.
Targeted. Okay, so what were the targets then? Based on what the sources detail, what kinds of sites got hit in this operation?
The sources specify the strikes hit dozens of military targets and Iranian nuclear sites.
Okay, both military and nuclear.
Both. And the Natanz, which we mentioned, Iran's main uranium enrichment facility, that's explicitly named as a key target.
Makes sense.
But beyond just the facilities, the targets also reportedly included individuals.
People.
Yeah. Nuclear scientists, military commanders, military bases. Netanyahu specifically mentioned targeting the heart of Iran's ballistic missiles program. So again, hitting those delivery systems as well as the production of the fissile material.
Okay, and this brings us to a really critical and frankly quite startling detail reported in the sources. Casualties among Iranian personnel, particularly high-level figures. What do the various sources confirm or indicate about this?
Yeah, this is where the reported precision and maybe the intent of the strike become even clearer, according to these reports. Iranian state media itself confirmed significant casualties among their top leadership.
They confirmed it themselves.
They did. They specifically reported the killing of the commander-in-chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. That's Major General Hossein Salami.
Wow, the head of the IRGC.
Exactly. And for anyone listening who isn't familiar, the IRGC is a huge deal. It's a major branch of Iran's military, deeply involved in, well, everything. Conventional ops, sensitive programs, regional influence. His death is significant.
Absolutely. Anyone else confirmed?
Yes. Iranian media also confirmed the deaths of two prominent nuclear scientists, Faroudin Abbasi and Mohammad Mehdi Tiranchi.
So, confirmed high-level military and scientific casualties reported by Iran's own state media. What did Israeli officials say or indicate about casualties on their side?
Well, Israeli official statements, as reported in the sources, seem to either corroborate this or at least strongly hint at the targeted nature of the strikes against key people.
How so?
One Israeli official was quoted indicating the strike likely killed the Iranian Armed Forces chief of staff and a number of senior nuclear scientists. Now, technically, Salami was head of the IRGC, not the overall Armed Forces Chief of Staff, but given his confirmed death and prominence, the sources generally interpret this as referring to him.
Okay.
And another Israeli security source was quoted saying that the chances were increasing that senior military leaders and nuclear scientists were successfully eliminated.
Eliminated. That's strong wording.
It is. It often implies targeted killing in this context. So the reports, taken together, strongly suggest that these weren't just accidental casualties. They were potentially deliberate objectives of the operation.
That paints a pretty stark picture, suggesting Israel was aiming to decapitate or at least significantly disrupt leadership and expertise within both Iran's military command and its nuclear scientific community.
That certainly seems to be the implication drawn from the reporting on the targets and the confirmed casualties.
Okay, what about the potential duration? Was this presented as a one-and-done kind of thing or something potentially longer?
The sources definitely indicate this wasn't planned as just a single, isolated strike, just to send a message.
Right.
Israeli sources are explicitly quoted saying this is not a one-day attack.
Not a one-day attack.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu himself stated quite clearly that the operation will continue for as many days it takes to remove this threat.
As many days as it takes.
Yeah. The reported intention from Israel, according to these sources, is to keep up its attacks against Iran until it feels the Iranian nuclear threat has been removed. Now, what that actually means in practice.
How long, how intense?
Exactly. That likely depends heavily on Iran's response, international pressure, a whole host of factors. But the stated intent suggests a potential campaign, not just a single raid.
And there was this analogy used by a former Israeli official, Naftali Bennett, to describe the strategy of hitting Iran directly, not just its proxies.
Yeah, that got picked up in a lot of the reporting. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett used the analogy of the head of the octopus.
The octopus?
He described Iran as an octopus of terror, suggesting its regional proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, groups in Syria, Yemen, etc., they're just the tentacles.
Right.
And he argued, it's time to hit the head of the octopus, meaning the strategy should shift from just constantly swatting at the tentacles, the proxies, to directly targeting the command and control, the funding, the core capabilities within Iran itself, especially its nuclear program.
So a fundamental shift in strategy.
That's the argument Bennett was making, and this strike seems to align with that kind of thinking. It resonated because it frames this potential strategic shift Israel seems to be undertaking.
Okay, let's connect these strikes now to the bigger picture, the broader context of Iran's nuclear program, and specifically what might have triggered this action right now, according to the sources. It seems tied to some recent findings by international bodies.
Absolutely. The sources directly link the timing of Operation Rising Lion to recent developments around Iran's nuclear program, particularly drawing on information from recent reports by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency.
The UN nuclear watchdog.
That's the one. Outlets like CBS, CNN, others provided analysis connecting these dots pretty clearly.
Okay, so what was so significant about these recent IAEA findings that seems to have factored into this?
Well, just days before the strike, the IAEA took a pretty major step. They formally censured Iran.
Censured, like a formal rebuke.
Exactly, a formal condemnation. And the sources state this is the first time they've done that in 20 years.
Wow, 20 years. What was the basis for the censure?
According to the reports, it was based on classified IAEA findings, indicating Iran hadn't been truthful about past military dimensions of its nuclear activities. Basically questions about whether they tried to build a bomb in the past. And also that Iran was violating existing diplomatic agreements about inspections, transparency, letting the IAEA see what they need to see. So this censure itself was a big diplomatic signal of mounting international frustration.
But the critical technical detail reported by the IAEA, the one highlighted in these sources as a potential trigger, seems to be about Iran's actual stockpile of enriched fuel and how pure it was.
This is probably the most immediate technical trigger mentioned in the sources, yeah. The IAEA report highlighted that Iran had acquired a sizable amount of enriched nuclear fuel.
Sizable amount.
And crucially, it noted the high quantity at a specific enrichment level. Both CBS and CNN sources explicitly point to the 60% enrichment level.
60%. Okay, for people listening, why is that 60% number so particularly concerning when we talk about nuclear proliferation?
Because, as it's explained in sources like the CBS report, 60% enrichment is technically very, very close to weapons-grade uranium.
Yeah.
Weapons-grade is typically around 90% enriched.
So it's a short hop from 60 to 90.
Technically, yes. Much shorter and easier than getting from natural uranium or low-enriched uranium up to 60%. As one CBS source put it, having a big stockpile at 60% allows Iran to, quote, quickly, if they made the political decision, seek to make a nuclear weapon.
Ah, so it shrinks the breakout time.
Exactly. That's the key concern. The breakout time, how long it would take to produce enough weapons-grade material for one bomb if they decided to go for it, becomes significantly shorter once you have a stockpile of 60% enriched material.
And that underpins that Israeli claim we mentioned earlier about enough material for 15 bombs in days.
Precisely. That alarming claim seems directly linked to the existence of this large, highly enriched stockpile. Even if, say, U.S. intelligence might assess Iran is further away from actually building the warhead itself, the material being there at 60% is a major threshold crossed.
Got it. And how did Iran react to this formal censure from the IAEA? Did they back down?
No, not according to one source covering these developments. Iran's response was reportedly defiant, not conciliatory at all.
What did they do?
Instead of scaling back, they apparently doubled down. They announced plans to establish a third nuclear enrichment facility.
A third one?
Yeah, and specifically stated they plan to upgrade the centrifuges, the machines that do the enriching, at their Fordo facility. Now, Fordo is significant because it's buried deep underground.
Right, the mountain facility.
Exactly. While Fordo wasn't explicitly listed as a target hit in this initial wave, according to the sources we have, this announcement right after the censure showed Iran basically asserting its perceived right to enrich uranium and escalating its activities in response to diplomatic pressure. That defiance likely just added fuel to the fire, exacerbating the threat perception.
Now, this is where it gets incredibly fascinating and just adds another layer of complexity. This major military action unfolded, but at the same time, there was this parallel diplomatic track happening, right? Aimed at trying to contain Iran's nuclear program.
It truly is fascinating timing. The U.S. and Iran were actually scheduled for a sixth round of nuclear talks, aimed at, reviving some kind of agreement.
And when were those talks supposed to happen?
They were set to take place in Oman on the upcoming Sunday, just 2 days after the Israeli strikes hit on Friday morning.
Wow, just 2 days later. Who was leading the U.S. side in those really sensitive negotiations?
The sources identify the key U.S. negotiator as Steve Witkoff.
Witkoff.
Yeah. He's described in the material as President Trump's envoy, also a personal friend, and notably a real estate developer, which kind of highlights the, let's say, unconventional nature of this diplomatic channel under that administration.
Okay. And Witkoff had apparently sent a proposal recently.
Yeah, reportedly he transmitted a proposal via Oman, the intermediary, to the Iranians about 2 weeks before these scheduled talks.
So there was something on the table. What was the core U.S. position, their red line, in those proposed negotiations, according to the sources outlining the U.S. stance?
According to these sources, the U.S. position was pretty firm, and it represented a really significant hurdle for Iran. The U.S. apparently did not want Iran to enrich uranium at all on its own territory.
Zero enrichment, even for civilian power.
Even for civilian purposes, like fuel for power plants. That was the reported position. Instead, they were offering alternatives, like Iran buying the necessary fuel from outside its borders.
Which sounds a bit like parts of the old 2015 deal, the JCPOA.
It does echo some provisions from that deal,
Mm.
where enriched fuel was shipped out, remember, to Russia in exchange for raw uranium. So the red line for a successful agreement for the U.S., explicitly stated in these sources, was 0 levels of enrichment inside Iran.
Zero enrichment on Iranian soil. That's a tough ask. Now, how do the sources connect the Israeli strikes to these upcoming, very sensitive talks? Was the timing just a coincidence?
The sources strongly suggest the timing was likely not a coincidence, and that Israel's action might have been influenced, at least partly, by this diplomatic activity.
How so?
One source specifically suggests that Israel became more serious about launching a strike as these talks seemed to be getting closer to maybe some kind of preliminary agreement.
An agreement Israel didn't like.
An agreement that Israel reportedly found unacceptable, particularly any provisions that might allow Iran to continue some level of uranium enrichment, even if it was limited or heavily monitored. Remember, Israel's public stance has often been zero enrichment as well.
Right.
And another report notes that Israeli strategic affairs officials had actually planned to meet with Steve Witkoff before those Oman talks were scheduled.
To lobby him.
Presumably to express their concerns, to try and influence the U.S. negotiating position, or maybe just understand where things were headed.
That really paints a picture of potential Israeli concern, maybe even alarm, that diplomacy might lead to an outcome they felt wouldn't be enough to guarantee their security against Iran's nuclear ambitions.
That seems to be the inference drawn in some of the analysis.
So given this intersection of military action and diplomacy, What was the immediate impact of the strike on the diplomatic process itself?
Well, across the board, the strike is widely seen in these sources as having severely impacted and likely stalled these
Okay.
negotiations,
Dissolved them completely.
at least for the time being. I mean, launching a major military strike with reported high-level casualties just days before scheduled talks. It massively raises tensions. It hardens positions on both sides. It makes any kind of diplomatic breakthrough much, much harder, if not impossible, in the short term. It should dramatically change the whole landscape for those planned discussions in Oman.
Right. And what about President Trump? What was his reported stance or reaction to the strike? The sources seem a bit mixed on this.
Yeah, they do present a somewhat complex, maybe even contradictory picture regarding President Trump's immediate reaction.
What's the contradiction?
Well, on one hand, he reportedly expressed a preference for a diplomatic solution to the Iran nuclear issue. One source quotes him as having reportedly argued against such a step, meaning the Israeli strike.
Argued against it.
Yeah, specifically saying he didn't want Israel going in militarily because he felt it would, quote, blow his diplomatic efforts, like the Oman talks he had set up.
Okay, that sounds like opposition.
But other sources in the material indicate that the White House was, in fact, expecting the strikes, that they had been given some prior notification by Israel.
So they knew it was coming.
That's what some sources suggest, despite the president's reported reluctance or his public statements favoring diplomacy. So there's this tension between reported opposition to the strike itself and reported foreknowledge or expectation that it was going to happen. It adds a layer of ambiguity, for sure, to the exact U.S. position at that moment.
Speaking of the U.S., let's clarify their position and their reported role, or maybe lack thereof, in Operation Rising Lion itself.
This is a point that multiple sources, including official U.S. statements, really emphasize. Secretary of State Mike Rubio was very quick to state, and multiple reports repeat this, that there was no U.S. involvement or U.S. assistance in the Israeli strikes.
No U.S. planes, no U.S. intelligence sharing for the strike itself.
That's the message, that
Yeah.
Israel took this as unilateral action. The U.S. goal seemed very clear: distance themselves militarily from the operation itself.
Okay, so the U.S. wasn't participating in the strikes, but their actions and their stated priorities shifted pretty dramatically right after the Israeli operation began, according to the sources.
Oh, absolutely. Once the strikes were underway and the potential for Iranian retaliation was suddenly very real, the U.S. priorities stated by Secretary Rubio and others immediately shifted
To what?
to protecting American forces and personnel stationed all across the Middle East region. That became job number one.
And importantly, the U.S. took some precautionary steps even before the strikes were launched, which suggests they had some level of anticipation that things might escalate, right?
Yeah.
What were those steps detailed in the sources?
Yeah, the sources report some pretty significant precautionary measures were taken beforehand. The State Department ordered non-essential government officials to leave Iraq
Lead Iraq.
and significantly drew down the U.S. diplomatic mission there. Also, the Pentagon authorized voluntary departure for military family members from various locations throughout the Middle East, specifically within the U.S. CENTCOM area of operations.
CENTCOM being Central Command, covering the Middle East.
Exactly. And the sources note that these warnings, these departures, came shortly after Iran had publicly threatened to target U.S. military bases in the region if a wider conflict broke out.
So the U.S. was preparing for potential blowback directed at its own assets and people.
It certainly looks that way, preparing proactively in response to the rising regional tensions, which likely included this anticipated Israeli action against Iran.
And there was also a heightened state of alert for the U.S. military command in the region itself.
Definitely. General Frank McKenzie, who used to head U.S. Central Command, he provided some analysis in one source. He described a very high state of alert for U.S. forces.
What did that involve?
He indicated that the current CENTCOM commander had taken steps like dispersing aircraft, repositioning naval ships, basically making them less vulnerable, harder for Iran to target effectively if Iran chose to retaliate against U.S. assets.
Makes sense.
And there was also reportedly clear and unambiguous messaging sent directly to Iran, warning them very strongly against attacking any U.S. targets.
Okay. What about the broader U.S. political reaction reported in the sources, beyond the administration saying we weren't involved?
Well, beyond Secretary Rubio's statement, other political reactions were reported. For instance, Republican Senator Ted Cruz publicly defended Israel's right to self-defense against what he termed the Iranian nuclear threat, with standard support for Israel's security concerns.
Right.
President Trump also reportedly convened a cabinet-level meeting right after the strikes. The expectation reported was that this meeting would focus on assessing the situation, coordinating the U.S. response to the potential fallout, figuring out the next steps.
Okay. Let's zoom out a bit and analyze the regional power dynamics as presented in the sources. General McKenzie, the former CNTCOM commander, he offered an assessment of Iran's military position relative to Israel's right now. What was his take?
General McKenzie's assessment, based on his deep experience in the region, was pretty blunt. He suggested Iran is currently generationally weakened against Israel.
Generationally weakened, why?
His reasoning, as reported, is that Iran's key proxy forces, he specifically mentioned Lebanese Hezbollah, various Syrian-based groups have been significantly degraded over the years.
By Israeli actions?
Yeah, by years of Israeli strikes targeting their weapon shipments from Iran, their bases, their personnel within Syria and elsewhere. He suggests these proxies are currently, quote, out of the fight in terms of posing a major conventional threat directly to Israel. This reduces Iran's ability to hit Israel hard through those third parties.
Okay. And how might Israel view that situation, that assessment?
Well, if McKenzie's assessment is accurate, it could be interpreted as suggested by CBS's Margaret Brennan in one source that Israel saw this moment, with Iran's proxies somewhat neutralized or at least weakened, as a moment of opportunity.
An opportunity to strike directly.
Potentially. It aligns with that head of the octopus argument we talked about from former PM Bennett. Maybe Israel felt the conditions were relatively more favorable for a direct strike on Iran itself, precisely because those traditional proxy retaliation avenues were perceived as less potent right now. It implies a strategic calculation about timing based on the shifting regional military balance.
And this is but you have to counterbalance that, right? Iran still has its own direct capabilities, even if its proxies are weakened against Israel specifically.
Oh, absolutely crucial point. McKenzie himself states very clearly that Iran still possesses its own weapon systems. We're talking potentially ballistic missiles, drones, weapons that could be fired directly from Iran.
Against whom?
Against U.S. bases in the region, or against U.S. partners like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. McKenzie explicitly states that any such attack on those targets would represent a marked widening of the war.
Taking it beyond just Israel and Iran?
Exactly. Escalating the conflict beyond the long-running Israel-Iran shadow war or proxy fights, potentially involving other major regional players and possibly drawing the U.S. in much more directly. It's a dangerous possibility.
That really highlights the razor's edge the whole region is on. Now, what does McKenzie identify as Iran's absolute highest strategic goal, and how does that likely influence how they might respond to this strike?
General McKenzie identifies Iran's #1 highest strategic goal as regime survival, just staying in power.
Regime survival.
And he explains that this calculation will heavily influence their decision-making about retaliation. Iran's leaders are described in the sources as realists. They understand the limits of their own conventional military capabilities, especially against a combined Israeli-U.S. force.
And they've taken hits before.
Exactly. As McKenzie puts it, they've been badly exposed and severely attrited by prior attacks. Think cyber operations like Stuxnet, assassinations of scientists, previous strikes on their assets and proxies. So this suggests their response will likely be carefully calibrated.
Calibrated how?
To avoid provoking an overwhelming counter-response that could genuinely threaten the regime's hold on power. They need to retaliate to save face, to show strength, but likely not in a way that invites an all-out war they probably can't win.
So maybe something more limited or asymmetric rather than a full-scale conventional war.
That seems plausible based on this analysis of their core priority. And McKenzie also mentions Iran's history of negotiation, even when it's painful in difficult circumstances.
What does he mean by that?
He brings up this concept of drinking from the poison chalice.
Drinking poison?
Yeah, it's a phrase often used to describe making a really difficult, unpalatable decision. Maybe a ceasefire or a negotiation that you hate, but you do it because it's necessary for survival.
Has Iran done that before?
He notes they have, citing the example of their decision to finally negotiate an end to the absolutely devastating Iran-Iraq war back in the late 1980s. They did that despite having previously vowed to fight on indefinitely. So it suggests that while they can be very defiant publicly, the regime is ultimately pragmatic. They could potentially return to diplomacy or find other ways to de-escalate if the pressure becomes truly existential.
Interesting. What about the bigger, longer-term fear, the one mentioned by former Israeli PM Bennett, the fear of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East if Iran does end up getting nuclear weapons?
Yeah, Naftali Bennett, in one of the sources, explicitly warned about this. He said if Iran successfully develops nuclear weapons, it could trigger a really dangerous cascade effect across the region.
Chain reaction.
Exactly. He specifically mentioned countries like Turkey and Egypt. He argued they might feel compelled to pursue their own nuclear capabilities to counter a nuclear-armed Iran. And that could lead to a full-blown nuclear arms race in, arguably one of the most volatile regions on the planet.
That really illustrates the incredibly high stakes, the proliferation risk that underpins Israel's whole stated rationale for this strike in the first place.
It absolutely does. It frames it as not just about Israel's security, but regional stability.
And finally, on the military side, McKenzie mentioned a potential limitation to Israel's capability, specifically regarding Iran's deepest, most protected nuclear sites.
Yes, that's an important nuance he raised. He notes that while Israel can obviously carry out significant strikes, inflict real damage like we saw reported, there are likely some of Iran's nuclear facilities, or maybe command centers, that are buried so deep underground.
Like Fordo.
Potentially Fordo or others. Sites that Israel's conventional bombs might not be able to reach effectively. These really hardened, deeply buried targets often require specialized bunker buster bombs or other specific ordnance.
Which Israel might not have.
Capabilities primarily held by the United States. That's the implication. It suggests that while Israel can conduct unilateral strikes like Operation Rising Lion, there might be limits to its ability to completely dismantle all of Iran's deepest held nuclear assets without some form of U.S. assistance. It highlights a potential dependency if this turned into a prolonged campaign targeting those hardest sites.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the global impact reported in the sources. What were the immediate effects felt in global markets as news of these strikes broke?
Well, the news sent immediate ripples, maybe even waves, through global financial markets. It reflected a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty.
Like what specifically?
Oil prices jumped significantly. Reports indicated increases of nearly 5%, which equated to over $3 a barrel. That's roughly a 6% price hike in a really short period.
Why the jump in oil?
Classic fear of disruption. Concern about potential damage to oil infrastructure or disruptions to shipping routes for oil tankers in the Persian Gulf region. The Middle East is just critical for global energy supplies.
Right. What else happened in the markets?
Alongside rising oil prices, U.S. stock futures dipped. Investors reacted negatively to the heightened geopolitical risk. Makes sense. And you also saw investors moving towards traditional safe haven assets, places where money tends to flow during times of instability.
Like gold.
Like gold, yeah. Also the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc. These are typical safe havens. So this market reaction, oil up, stocks down, money flowing to safety, clearly shows real fear about conflict and its potential to destabilize the global economy.
And beyond the markets, this situation could also trigger further international action against Iran, right? Diplomatically or economically?
Yes, the sources definitely note that. The combination of that recent IAEA censure we discussed, plus Iran's defiant actions afterwards announcing the new facility, upgrading centrifuges that increases the likelihood of renewed international pressure on Iran.
What form could that take?
It could manifest as, say, revived international sanctions, or maybe even new action taken to the United Nations Security Council. Although, getting consensus there, especially among the permanent members like Russia and China, can often be pretty challenging.
Yeah.
But the pressure is likely to build.
Okay. So bringing all of this together now from all the different sources we've unpacked today, let's connect back to you, everyone listening. We've tried to synthesize what is really a complex and obviously rapidly evolving picture here.
We really have.
Yeah.
And I think the core takeaways distilled from all these sources are pretty clear. First, you have a significant named Israeli military operation Rising Lion that targeted key Iranian military and nuclear sites.
Right.
Second, there were reported, and in some cases confirmed by Iran itself, high-level casualties among Iranian commanders and scientists.
Yeah.
A major blow.
Yeah.
Third, the United States has been very clear stating its lack of direct involvement in the strike itself, while at the same time focusing intensely on protecting its own forces in the region and taking precautionary steps even beforehand.
A fine line they're walking.
A very fine line. And fourth, all of this unfolded at an incredibly critical moment, both for regional stability and for global diplomacy, immediately disrupting those scheduled nuclear talks.
And this isn't just, another distant news headline playing out far away. As we saw with the market reactions, this is a situation with potentially cascading effects.
Ah,
Effects that can touch everything from political negotiations about the future of nuclear proliferation
to the price you pay for gas at the pump.
to the stability of global markets. The sources really paint this picture of calculated military action driven by what Israel frames as a profound sense of existential threat,
Colliding with diplomatic efforts that were maybe already faltering.
all set against this backdrop of deep-seated regional animosity and this looming specter of a nuclear Middle East.
Yeah. Understanding the nuances, the why Israel says it acted, the specifics of the targets and the reported casualties, how Iran's potential responses are guided by that goal of regime survival, the complexities of the U.S. role, their involvement or lack thereof, their preparedness, and that immediate global economic fallout, all drawn directly from these different reports.
It gives you, hopefully, a much more informed perspective on what's truly happening and why it matters so much.
Right. It lets you look beyond just the breaking news alerts and grasp the underlying strategic calculations, the technical nuclear realities that are driving some of this, and this really intricate web of diplomatic and military actions playing out in real time.
So as we wrap things up on this particular deep dive, we've seen a dramatic preemptive strike, reports of a significant human cost among Iran's leadership, diplomacy seemingly knocked off course, maybe indefinitely.
And a region, and frankly, the world, kind of holding its breath, bracing for the potential next steps. It's an incredibly volatile, incredibly uncertain situation, building on decades of tension.
It really is.
And I guess, given everything we've managed to unpack from these sources today, the stated reasons, the specific targets, the reported deaths, the timing right before those talks, the whole regional dynamic, what do you think, for everyone listening, is the single most critical factor to watch in the coming days or weeks? What's going to determine how this situation evolves from here?
Is it going to be Iran's specific form of retaliation? Will it be measured or will it escalate? Is it the fate of any future nuclear talks? Can they even be revived? Or maybe it's something else entirely, maybe a reaction from another player in the region we haven't focused on as much.
A lot to watch.
That is definitely the question to ponder as events continue to unfold. And on that note,
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the source material today.
stay curious, keep those questions coming. We'll keep digging into the information as it develops.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
And hey, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss our next exploration.